Okay, so here we are with part two of my powerlifting programming series. Last time we did a big deep dive on talking about just much more specificity and how that relates to really trying to manage fatigue and really how all that is so crucial into trying to create the best powerlifting program, not only for yourself, but for your clients if you're a coach. And today we're going to be really discussing just much more what type of things actually play in that specificity still. So my original goal was to discuss today the concept of volume and intensity. But after I really got to work on trying to get all my materials together and discuss this, really volume in itself is going to be plenty enough of a topic today to where I'm just going to cover it and I'll save intensity for another video next time. That way we can keep this video from not being 30, 40 minutes long and keep it relatively short. So when it comes to powerlifting programming and discussing volume, what is it? So I'm sure it's a term that if you've been in the gym in any sort of manner, you've heard the term volume. Or heck, if you paid attention good enough in math class or science class, you heard volume then. Well, obviously in that context, volume was just much more discussing how much of something we have. Say it's, how much space does something take up? Liters, square feet, all that type of, cubic feet. All those type of things are what volume would be applied to in the rest of our life. And it's not that different for powerlifting programming. When we are discussing volume within powerlifting, it's a pretty similar concept. It's just literally referring to the amount of training that we are doing when it comes to in relation to the specific training for that sport. Well, beyond that, usually when you hear powerlifting volume discussed, or just volume within the gym and just fitness industry discussed, I think there's a lot of different ways it's referred to and kind of how it's measured. Some I'd consider to be a little bit more accurate than others. More commonly, I'd say the most, if you're just in a gym setting, commercial gym, and you hear somebody say this high volume's killing me, I'd say much more of the time they're just much more referring to higher rep sets and just being in a higher rep range. When that's not necessarily true, comparing it to the more true context of what volume I'd say is really defined as and how it's more accurately measured. And what I mean by that is the concept of tonnage. So when discussing tonnage, really that means it's just the mathematical equation of the total amount of work done. So the sets times the reps times the amount of weight, you multiply all that together and you come out with a rather large number, and that is your quote-unquote tonnage. So that's why discussing that high volume is going to be a high rep range might not necessarily be accurate. And I made a little chart kind of displaying that pretty accurately. So we're going to kind of start off with lower loads, because say, if we are doing a higher rep range, that almost guarantees, or it does guarantee, that we are going to be using a relatively lighter load. So basically I have somebody here, let's say this is squat. Say they have a 1 rep max squat of 400 pounds, right? But say they do 3 sets of 12 at 50%, which I'd say would be a pretty appropriate range for something that higher rep. Their calculated tonnage would be 7,200. But then say let's kind of keep going down that. Say if somebody does 4 sets of 8 at 60%, which once again I'd say would be a pretty relatively appropriate percentage range, there would be even slightly more tonnage on top of that, 7,680. But then even past that, let's go up to 80% for 5 sets of 5. That would be a total of 8,000 tonnage. So obviously the reps are significantly decreasing, but the load and the amount of sets being performed are drastically increasing. So the overall tonnage increases as well. And that really brings us around to more accurately, I'd say a lot of very successful powerlifting coaches, the main way that they do keep track of volume is much more just the amount of working sets being performed instead of using the old school kind of tonnage type of way. And really that does come down to just we can easily add in a lot of junk volume or a lot of junk tonnage just by adding in higher rep sets or more sets when that's not necessarily going to be truly accurate, especially if we are doing it at a significantly lighter load. Because say for this instance, if we are, doing 3 sets of 12 at 50%, just as we discussed last time when it comes to specificity, while that still might be a considerable amount of work done and a considerable amount of tonnage, the actual amount of training adaptation for increasing our 1 rep max is probably going to be relatively low. But say if we can calculate something like doing 5 sets of 5 or 4 sets of 3, something in a much higher range, even though the tonnage might even come out to be less than, if we do 4 sets of 3 at a much higher percentage and a much higher RPE, the actual amount of training disruption, the amount of training just adaptations we get from that disruption is going to be significantly higher. So that's why it has become relatively more common that a lot of powerlifting coaches to actually keep track of how much volume a lifter is doing. They're going to keep track of the amount of actual working sets performed. Well, I still do a lot of both. I'd say primarily I do use a lot of just keeping track of the actual amount of sets performed on squat, bench, and deadlift throughout the week, as well as the amount of accessory sets. I'd still keep track of tonnage. It's really easy just to have a spreadsheet do it for us on the back end, but there always is still going to be a little bit of merit to be able to go check on that for whatever reason it may be. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to be consistently refining somebody's programming to where they're going to be seeing the best adaptations possible while keeping the amount of fatigue relatively low. That way we can, once again, trial and error, keep improving it, keep refining it. And at that point, it's like, why would we not use more data? So it's, like I said, very easy to keep track of tonnage on the back end, very easy to keep track of sets. So I like to use both at my disposal to help make future adjustments and keep refining somebody's training. Okay, so knowing the actual more accurate ways to define and maybe track our volume is all good and dandy to know, but why is that actually important? So much like we discussed in the last video on discussing fatigue and load management, volume is going to be our biggest tool in doing so. While once again, intensity will be a big part of that as well, and so is frequency. I'd say the king and cornerstone of even both of those other things is going to essentially be volume, because both those other things still are going to tie back to the amount of volume being done. Say if our volume falls on being on the too heavy side, then it'll be to where, once again, we are carrying way too much fatigue. We are going to start seeing a lot of aches and pains, increase our chance of injury, and as well as we will start see a diminish in our performance and even have a regression of skill if it gets to be too far. But let's say that we are doing too little volume. So now we are kind of doing the opposite, or we are doing the opposite. But in this case, we are going to see that we aren't progressing very much, if at all. If we aren't giving ourselves enough stimulus to actually encourage an adaptation, then we won't progress. But say we are doing just enough volume to at least still see an adaptation, then sure, at least if there's some there, but still, we could be leaving a lot off the table to where, hey, if we just had, X amount more volume to where we could still be progressing that much faster, but not overdoing it to where we're seeing those side effects of overdoing the volume. In the last video, we had a bit of a discussion talking about frequency and kind of a dose-response relationship and how that is such a crucial thing that kind of relies on one another. So that is where discussing our volume within a session can change our ability to have more frequency. Something that we had discussed a lot last time was also how ideally, if somebody could train more frequently, that would be great because the more often we can get practice, the better. And all this is on a relative time scale. It's not like, hey, if we can just cram in a ton of volume into one big session per week, that we will see the same type of progression if we spread that amongst 3 different sessions per week. That's just not the case. The more often we can get touches on something, the more often we can practice, the better at it we will be. That's where it gets to be insanely crucial to know how to appropriate that volume session to session. Because again, if we have a lot of volume within one session, that will increase the amount of time that before we have a really good feeling session, we have that kind of peak in our dose-response relationship to when we'll be able to have a very high-performance session again as well. But if we have a lower volume session, it'll be the opposite. It'll give us the ability to have a sooner and more effective session that much quicker. So a quick example would be using this little chart that I have here. Let's say if we are trying to bench 3 days a week, this would kind of explain that perfectly on how we'd want to kind of line that up. So let's say that the light blue is going to be our tertiary session, the red is going to be our secondary, and the green is going to be our primary session. So let's say if we start off with that primary session, sure, we'll have a bigger dip in fatigue, but we're going to have a much higher and much longer ability to perform well, but there will also still be that kind of accumulated fatigue back with that. So I'd say following that session, it would probably be most ideal to have our light blue, our tertiary day, to say even if, the stimulus might be less, we can still get in a day where the overall volume and just the overall load that we are being applied to is going to be significantly less. Then use that small little kind of just, fitness fatigue model there to progress that into a secondary session, which will be a very, very good primer for our primary session, making sure that our baseline and our skill is going to be very high again. All right, so how can we actually apply this to make it, usable for anybody listening to this? Like if you're trying to coach yourself or you're trying to pick on new clients, here is a ways that we can kind of start off with some assumptions without just being like, hey, use your data of training and just leave you guys at that. So obviously you guys know how to maybe see what signs to look for, say if you are giving too much volume or giving too little, but say you're starting off with somebody new. How can we actually take an accurate look at this and give something that's going to be a relatively good start when it comes to how to assign proper amounts of volume? So here I'm going to show you guys kind of some just volume heuristics, just kind of things that are pretty well known within the industry, not just from, a lot of past coaches, but if you've coached a lot of athletes yourself, you've probably noticed a lot of these things just as a kind of a normal consistency. Once again, these things I'm about to show you, they aren't guarantees. There's going to always still be individual differences. But once again, it's like, hey, here's a really good place for you to gather some information and really make some good educated decisions based off of that. and then look at some data moving forward based off how your athletes or yourself respond to these. So here I have those heuristics. So on the right side here is going to be if we have much higher volume, and on the left side if we have much lower volume. So starting off on the left, somebody's going to be able to handle a lot lower volume if they're either a lot higher in body weight, if they're going to be a lot stronger, or otherwise known as more advanced, if they are a natural athlete and not using performance-enhancing drugs, or say if they are a lot taller, or if they have to have a lot more bar path travel, anything like that in relation to how much the bar has to move. Men can't handle quite as much volume as women most of the time, or obviously if somebody has poor nutrition, if they're in a severe calorie deficit, if they are lacking on a lot of micronutrients or anything along those lines, or even obviously a severe lack of sleep. On the other side of that, if somebody's lighter, they tend to be able to handle a lot more volume. If somebody's a lot more novice, they tend to respond and handle a lot more volume as well. Obviously, performance-enhancing drugs can increase somebody's ability to recover and handle more volume as well. If somebody's having to move the bar less, so that doesn't necessarily mean that they're shorter, but say if somebody is a sumo puller versus conventional, sumo pullers tend to handle volume a lot better and need a lot more volume in order to aid that progression due to less bar travel. Or say if somebody has a high arch bench press or anything like that, they tend to be able to handle a lot more volume or frequency there as well. Females tend to handle a lot more volume too. Obviously, if somebody's quality nutrition, if they're in a calorie surplus, getting lots of vitamins and minerals, getting lots of protein, they're going to have very good recovery and can handle more as well. Then obviously on top of that, if somebody's getting very plentiful sleep and they're getting lots of recovery in other ways, they're going to be able to handle more volume in that instance as well. One thing I just realized I did not put on here as well is the amount of external stress. So say if somebody has a very stressful life, if they're, a single parent taking care of 4 kids versus somebody that, doesn't even go to work or do anything, they can literally make training their sole priority, then they can handle a little bit more volume as well. So after applying these things, if you know that you have a 308-pound athlete that totals 2,000 pounds and is natural, you'll know that they probably don't need as much training volume, and you can start them off there with less working sets per week. And once again, I'd say most of the time it's always better to kind of err towards underdoing it than ever overdoing it. So if you're starting off with somebody new, or if you're starting off on programming yourself, don't be afraid to just kind of give yourself too little of work. It's a heck of a lot easier to add more work and see the adaptations flourish after that than trying to force too much work at first, then having to really kind of see all those bad things happen, aches and pains, watch yourself regress, and a lot of these things that aren't fun to deal with, and then trying to have to figure out how much do I pull back? Do I pull back 2 sets a week on squat, or do I pull back 6 sets a week on squat? So once again, it's much matter to slowly add back in to make sure you're finding that proper dose-response relationship. And the last important thing to discuss when it comes to training volume is how we're going to get a lot of very good just physiological adaptations from it. A big part of powerlifting that I feel like some people outside looking in don't realize that having a lot of muscle tissue is a very good thing. That if we can generate a lot of hypertrophy, that is going to do nothing but increase our potential to have more strength. Well, I've really honed in a lot, or I guess kind of beat the dead horse, saying that powerlifting is a skill and a neurological adaptation, which we'll talk about more with intensity next video. But it's still important to have that musculature to give us that potential to have more neurological adaptations. Because if we're just kind of keeping ourselves at a lower amount of muscle mass, the ceiling that we have is a lot smaller. But the more muscle that we build, we're going to help keep raising that ceiling to where we have that much more strength potential is what we call it. So not only is volume very good for, once again, more skill practice, more training exposure, and trying to, once again, just give us more opportunity to refine our skill, it's going to be very, very important to help us build a lot more muscle and give us a lot more mechanical tension, a lot more mechanical load, which is very crucial for adding that more muscle mass and strength potential. But next time we will discuss intensity and how that kind of plays a role into all these things, once again, how they all play a role into each other, and how each thing needs to be carefully calculated and carefully planned to make sure that we are having the best programming setup possible. And while I'm very excited to talk about intensity, actually I only have 2 more kind of basic powerlifting programming topics following that I'd like to discuss. So if you guys have some more like intermediate or advanced things that you would like to know following those, comment below on what you'd like to know about, or even heck, shoot me a message. Like I said last time, I'm a very open book and I'd love to help you guys. But if you've listened this far, thank you very much. Any questions, let me know.